All right, welcome to Evolution Podcast 10, where we are going to look at, since Hardy and Weinberg told us what a non-evolving population ought to look like, then the obvious question is, well, then what things do cause evolutionary change? What things put pressure on a population and cause it to not be the same from one generation to the next? So that's what we're going to look at in this podcast. So remember what Hardy and Weinberg told us a non-evolving population must do. They must have a large population size, no gene flow, no mutations, completely random mating, and no natural selection. Okay? So that means that if any one of these parameters is not in place, any one of them, then evolution of some sort will be occurring. Okay? So let's look then at those situations that can cause evolutionary change. Okay? Mutations, allowing genes to flow between populations, non-random mating as opposed to random mating, genetic drift. Now that's the one thing that's not really recognizable as part of their parameters for not allowing evolution. This is referring to not a large population size, but a very small population size. And then, of course, natural selection can cause evolutionary change. So basically the opposites of all of Hardy and Weinberg's conditions will cause evolutionary change. So let's look at each of these. First, mutation in the genes, variation. Mutation creates variation in organisms, and all of a sudden we're not equal anymore. New mutations are constantly appearing, and mutations, of course, if you'll recall, are changes in the DNA sequence, which also causes changes in amino acid or protein sequences, which change the proteins and their structures and functions. So any changes in proteins, DNA proteins, can change phenotype, physical appearance, physical abilities, and therefore change fitness. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Gene flow is, of course, when individuals are allowed to move freely in and out of populations, as they will often do. For example, winds and insects distribute seeds and pollen in an environment between populations. Animals migrate. They don't just stay in one place, or at least they very often do not. Little subpopulations of organisms can have different allele frequencies, and if they are allowed to move freely back and forth, then that genetic mixing across regions can cause differences in allele frequencies and so on. So let's look at this in terms of human evolution. Gene flow in human populations is increasing due to increased travel and that increased travel transfers alleles between different populations that would never have interacted before. What this is resulting in is greater similarities among all populations. People are going to, as this continues, look more and more the same. As these populations mingle, these alleles are going to be spread throughout populations, and there will be less distinct lines between people from one geographic area and another. Okay, and the same would be seen in all kinds of populations in which gene flow occurred. Okay. Non-random mating causes evolution. So when an organism chooses a mate for some particular reason, whatever that may be. Now, there are two main types of non-random mating that we will look at. They are inbreeding and sexual selection. So let's look at both of those. Inbreeding. When individuals tend to mate with their nearer neighbors rather than organisms that are further away, which seems highly likely because it's just easier. But it does increase your likelihood of mating with a close relative, because obviously the organisms closest to you are going to tend to be your family members. The most extreme form of inbreeding, of course, would be self-fertilization, like we've already seen in Mendel's pea plants. What inbreeding tends to do is it tends to decrease the number of heterozygotes. Why? Well, you can imagine if they're a population full of heterozygotes and heterozygotes breed, okay? Well, when these heterozygotes breed, at least half of their offspring are not going to be heterozygous anymore. These guys and these guys are going to be homozygous and have those characteristics. And so every time heterozygotes breed together, they don't replenish the population with completely all heterozygous. So they're going to decrease over time, and the homozygous phenotypes will increase. And so obviously it does increase the number of homozygotes in the population. And when homozygotes are increased, the likelihood of potentially harmful recessive conditions making themselves obvious in the population also goes up. The other type of non-random mating is sexual selection, and there are two types of this. Intrasexual selection within one gender, and in this sort of sexual selection, males fight each other, and so the winner of the fight gets the girl. And so that kind of pushes the male population to be bigger, stronger, antlers, those kinds of things that can be used to fight. Intersexual selection is the kind that is most, I think we focus on most in biology anyway, where females choose who they like the best. Showy feathers or something like that, big, beautiful red plumage on a cardinal, for example, or a peacock's tail. So the question seemed to be obvious. Why would anyone choose characteristics like showy feathers? The dummy could get eaten. What an idiot to have showy feathers. It seems like that we wouldn't want that. But those showy feathers obviously show health, vigor. Parasitized birds, weak birds tend to have dull feathers. And so if you can have enough energy and so on to produce these beautiful colors, beautiful feathers, then perhaps that is eye-catching and indicative of really good genes and good health, and that you will be a good mate. Both of these things, of course, are dangerous to the male, both of them. Obviously, males fighting with each other is dangerous. Somebody could get hurt. This is dangerous because often the males are drawing attention to themselves and make them very easily predated upon. But obviously, they must have a high, even though they have a high cost for the male, they also must have a high benefit, or else they wouldn't occur. These males must get selected by the female, for example, and get to pass their genes on to the next generation, which in the end is what it's all about. So sexual selection results in sexual dimorphism, and what that means is really distinct secondary sexual characteristics between males and females. Males and females are very obvious to tell apart. Secondary sexual characteristics are characteristics, of course, that are different in the genders, but not directly related to the reproductive organs, testes and ovaries. Obviously, those will be different. But we're talking about things like size or color, that lion's mane, for example, antlers on a deer or elk, as is in the picture, things like that. They're not directly related to reproduction, but they are related into getting the male the opportunity to reproduce. Okay? All right. Number 4, genetic drift. Genetic drift, remember, is the opposite of that large population size that would not lead to any evolutionary change. This is a small population size. Okay? It occurs when a small population is in place. So what genetic drift is changes in the gene pool of a small population due to random chance, okay? Much like with multiple trials in an experiment, the reason we want to have lots and lots of trials in an experiment and not just 1 or 2 is because if there is a random chance goof up in the 1 or 2, then that's going to dramatically affect your experiment. Whereas if you have 1,000 trials, then one random chance goof up is still going to leave a lot of your data intact to make sense of. Much in that way, random chance events affect small populations much more than they do large ones, okay? And in fact, genetic drift is often the greatest factor causing evolutionary change when the population is fairly small, a much bigger factor than natural selection when the population size is small. I think it's important when we talk about genetic drift and all of these that we often think evolution, natural selection. Natural selection is not the only thing that causes evolutionary change. Random events can send a population on an evolutionary path also. And that's really, really important to keep in mind. For example, if we look at this population of beetles, okay, maybe the green ones in this environment stand out to predators and they get eaten. And so over time, you'd have more and more of these brown beetles that were able to survive and pass their genes on to their offspring. Okay? That would be natural selection causing this outcome. But if suppose you just have a small population of beetles and someone randomly steps on some green beetles and kills them, it's not really because they were standing out more. It's just because somebody's big dumb foot accidentally crushed them. But that too is going to affect the population that you have in the future because there's less of these green beetles and there was such a small population to start with that it's going to really affect what the population looks like in the future. Okay, so selection versus genetic drift. We lose green beetles because they are not well adapted to the environmental pressures present, and genetic drift, it's just a dumb accident that causes the loss of this green beetle gene. Okay? So there are two major ways genetic drift occurs that we talk about. One is called founder effect. Founder effect is when a small group splinters off from a population and starts a brand new population, a new colony. For example, Darwin's finches, we can think of those. The other is a bottleneck, where some disaster, something happens to take a large population and reduces it drastically to a small number. Like that has happened with cheetahs. So let's talk about both of those. Bottleneck effect, let's hit that one first. Bottleneck effect, you have in this illustration, you've got this bottle full of the parent population. This is their gene pool, the blue genes and the yellow genes, okay, marbles. But a bottleneck is when just a few of these genes are allowed to make it to the next generation. Maybe a bunch of organisms get killed off. And by chance, just this very few genes are left behind in a very few organisms to reproduce. These are our surviving individuals. Now, what's going to happen is the next generation, if you look at this bottle, their gene pool is going to be different. And they're going to have a lot more blue genes than they did originally here. There were probably equal amounts of blue and yellow in this bottle, but now in this next generation, there's going to be lots more blue present because of this bottleneck the population passed through. So some random event, a fire, a flood, a tornado, whatever, dramatically cuts down the population size, and it does it fairly indiscriminately. It just wipes out whoever's there. And in such a situation, the survivors of that event may not be representative of the original population that was there. Usually what happens is variability in the genes is reduced because some alleles might be just completely wiped out from the gene pool. And so there might not be as much variety as what you once had. And this is not due to fitness. Surviving or not surviving is basically due to just dumb luck. The tornado wiped out everybody but 2 or 3 deer, and those are the ones that get to survive, not because they were outwitting the tornado, they just got lucky. Okay. A great example of a bottleneck in real life are cheetahs. Cheetahs that are alive today share a very small number of alleles together in common. In other words, there's not much diversity, less than 1%. There's a small number of alleles in the gene pool, and it's shared by all cheetahs. So if all cheetahs, it's almost like they're all identical twins. They're so very, very similar. And what caused this similarity in all their genes is two bottlenecks. One 10,000 years ago caused by the Ice Age, but also in the last 100 years caused by humans destroying the habitat and poaching, killing cheetahs. Another example of a bottleneck is the northern elephant seal. In California, it was hunted down to 20, literally 20 individuals. It has since rebounded beautifully to over 30,000, but there is very little diversity in this population. The population, all the individuals are identical in like 24 gene loci that have been studied. There's a lot more variation in the southern elephant seal that didn't pass through this bottleneck at those same 24 loci. So it's just another example. So this raises real issues with conservation. Bottlenecking, which is really important to consider. When you have lost all that variety, it reduces an organism's ability to adapt. There's no variety there to respond to varied environmental situations. So breeding programs that are breeding pandas, for example, or other endangered species have to consciously try to outcross to avoid those dangerous recessive alleles that can cause genetic defects, and they have to try to outcross to increase the variety in the population if the population is ever going to truly be successful again. Another cause of genetic drift is something called founder effect, and that is similar, but it's not because a population gets wiped out except for a few. It's that a few get to colonize a new area. So when a new population is started by only a few individuals from an originally larger population. So by sheer random chance, because like, for example, this was a large population of ladybugs over here, and some were red and some were green, and they seem to be, more red, but not that many more. But because of whatever storm came around or whatever happenstance occurred, a few got blown over to another island or whatever, and they all happened to be red. So this island is not going to have that green gene to work with. And so this founder effect is going to cause that population on the new island to look kind of different. And so the gene pool of the new population is skewed toward the red in this case. A great example of this in real life is, on an island in the Atlantic Ocean, kind of the southern Atlantic. If we're looking here, obviously here is Africa, here is South America. The island is down here called Tristan da Cunha. And on this island, it was colonized years ago by a population from mainland, golly, I can't remember. But one of the colonists that came to the island happened to have a gene for a reasonably rare disease which causes blindness in people. And now, because of that one colonist that happened to come over and colonize the small island, all the descendants of this island, this disorder is much more frequently occurred among the people of this island than anywhere else in the world, or certainly from this original mainland population where these people came from. Okay? All right, the last cause or agent of evolution, of course, is natural selection, but I want you to really consider, we've had 4 things that can cause allele and genotype frequencies to change in populations, and none of those 4 was natural selection. Natural selection is what we always focus on when we talk about evolution, because this is the only agent of evolution that leads to adaptive changes that make an organism really well suited to its environment, but it's not the only thing that can cause evolution to happen in a population. It's just the only thing that causes evolution to happen, resulting in organisms that are better adapted to their surroundings. So Remember that natural selection is the differential survival and, more importantly, differential reproduction of organisms due to changing environmental conditions. So some organisms are going to survive better and thus reproduce better and send their genes on to the next generation. Many kinds of things can influence that, but whatever the environmental conditions that the organisms are responding to, the combination of alleles that provides the greatest fitness is going to increase in number in the population. It is, and this is the important thing to take away from this slide right here, it is the only cause of evolution that is actually adaptive, that's going to result in these dark moths, for example, that blend into their environment better than these light colored ones. Okay, so please remember those 5 agents of evolution and how they're kind of the opposite of what would occur in a non-evolving Hardy-Weinberg setup, and that almost always in any population on Earth, some of these are going to always be in play. So again, emphasizing that Hardy-Weinberg is a case for a standard of comparison, and this is more real life. Okay, so thanks for watching. I will see you in the next podcast. Take care.